Buenos días.
Good morning and welcome again to this doctoral seminar of the European Charles V Award, Antonio Tajani, on the European Union and the principle of solidarity. We're going to start the last panel of these 3 days. This panel will be chaired by Professor Eric BUSSIÈRE, so there's no need to introduce him. I'm just going to say that he's a Professor Emeritus, Sorbonne University, Jean Monnet Chair of the History of European Construction. He's one of the forefathers of this seminar. He's very, very aware of everything that is going to be addressed here. So thanks, Eric BUSSIÈRE, and the floor is yours to chair the next presentation. The floor is yours.
So it's the last paper, the last presentation, and it's a very interesting paper because it's the first in our seminar to deal with the relationship with solidarity and new technologies. And I think it's very important. New technologies as a mean to build solidarity, but also the consequence, the legal consequence, the consequence of new technology on regulations. So it's a very fundamental point, and it's the first time we speak about this. I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to ask questions about technological aspects and links between technology and law, but I just want to present now Patricia Gonza lez because I'm not surprised by your paper about drones. As I explained, it seems to be a very specific subject, but it's very large. It offers us a very large perspective on important aspects. And I am not surprised when I read your CV because you had a degree in business administration with a sensibility to economics from one side, but you are also preparing a thesis in law, and you are interested in a specific subject as European and competition law, aeronautic law. That's very important, and I think we will have the opportunity to discuss all this after your presentation. So we have the floor.
En primer lugar, dar las gracias al profesor.
I want to start by thanking Professor Eric BUSSIÈRE for his really nice words. And I want to thank Professor Eric BUSSIÈRE on his words. And he was very accurate when he said that I'm going to address a topic that is very, very current, or at least I find it very, very current. I hope you share my view. I want to start by thanking the Yuste Foundation for giving us this opportunity, especially Professor Juan Carlos Moreno and Professor Freireches, Miguel Ángel Martín, coordinator. I want to thank you for all the support that we have received whenever we have needed anything, and the whole jury of the seminar. We are part of the seminar, but the jury is a crucial part of the seminar. I'm the last one, so I can congratulate all my colleagues, knowing what I'm talking about. My colleague Ruben started the seminar, and we thought that I thought that being the last I wouldn't get nervous, but I'm as nervous as if I had been the first. I hope to be I hope to be up to my task. I think everyone gave a different viewpoint on solidarity. I would like to start my presentation with a personal reflection. When I heard about this opportunity when I had the opportunity to connect my thesis to solidarity, in the beginning I was shocked. And I thought, will I be able to connect drones to solidarity? And then I reached the conclusion that drones are currently a new technology that is used, for example, in the case of natural catastrophes or disasters. I think solidarity there is obvious. When I chose my topic 2 years ago, I would have never thought that drones would ever have the impact that have had and still have and will have in the future. It's impossible to avoid COVID-19 in my paper. COVID-19 was a milestone. And I absolutely feel fortunate. And I'm nervous because I hope to be able to contribute with my work and to help the authorities to provide services in situations like this of a disaster. The title of my paper is Drones as Tools on the service to the civil protection mechanism of the European Union for the Solidarity Clause. Before starting my presentation, I want to say that the number of catastrophes has increased rapidly in the last decade. And not only has the number increased, the effects of these catastrophes are ever more serious. Authorities have stated their concern. Some examples are all the documents and action plans and also the mechanisms that nowadays allow the coordination of actions. In the Charles V European Award 2018, Antonio Tajani was awarded, and he said something that I'm going to repeat. I'm going to repeat his quote literally. Mr. Tajani said, "Separate, our nations are minuscule and powerless. Together, we shall have the strength to overcome any challenge." That statement translates in the nature of the member states and the European Union. That sentence is the grounds for my work. As we can see in this presentation, I am going to briefly introduce my work, and the second point will be talking about the main aspects adopted by the UN in situations of catastrophe, and then we will go down to talk about the contribution to European institutions. And I mentioned two clauses, the Solidarity Clause and the Civil Protection Mechanism of the EU. And then fourth, we will talk about the increase of new technologies in situations of catastrophe and drones as operational tools. And then I'll wrap up with my findings. It seems hard to start my presentation with these images, but these are the images that we find in the news almost every day. We are suffering fires, floodings, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis. All of these situations cause major damages. I will mention these damages, but they also make public administrations and states take measures. Administrations need to take measures. When? Only when there are catastrophes, or maybe we should focus on preventing these type of situations. I wanted to, in this slide, probably you can't see it very well, but these are the number of deaths as until 2015 or 2012. I can't see it very well. Until 2012. So these are the number of deaths globally due to catastrophes. These are just figures. I'm just giving figures. The Hyogo Framework for Action, I will refer to it later, includes these figures. 700,000 people lost their lives. We should try to retain these figures in our mind. As I said, the ceaseless growth of catastrophes goes on. And the European Union has already stated that this is going to go on. The last experiences are floodings in Central Europe in 2021, fires in the US in 2021, and the COVID-19 pandemic that started in 2019, 2020, and it's still going on. These are just some examples that make it clear that we have to wonder whether nations are ready to face the consequences of catastrophes. I must emphasize that the there is no chance of having an absence of risk. We may say that risk is inherent or intrinsic to the planet. However, the frequency, the complexity, and the intensity of these catastrophes can be addressed through different legal instruments that will try to mitigate, to a certain extent, these situations. I emphasized three international instruments that are especially relevant internationally, but also on an EU level. The first text is the Hyogo Framework for Action for 2005-2015, entitled Increase of Resilience in Nations and Communities in the Face of Catastrophes. This text is one of the first documents trying to establish the main guidelines for prevention and preparation or readiness against catastrophes, with the clear goal of decreasing risks. That's why the risk analysis, coordination, and cooperation proved to be essential to improve action strategies. However, regardless of the document being adopted, and this is where we should try to keep those figures in our mind. During 2005 to 2015, during that period, there were over 700,000 people died. 1.4 million people were injured. 23 million people were homeless. Homeless as a result, and 1,500 million people were damaged. And the economic losses are also assessed, and the economic losses are 1.3 billion euro. In the face of these figures, the UN calls for an improvement of those aspects that were considered satisfactory in the first place, that were considered correct to face crisis, but that have proved to be insufficient. So we have to wonder why the UN and its Hyogo Framework for Action had to be reviewed. In my view, the action of public powers is characterized by focusing more on the aftermath of a catastrophe. That is, public powers have focused on their response and recovery capacity. On the bottom, you have the 4 stages of the catastrophe. First, prevention. Second, preparation. Third, response. And fourth, recovery. Before, all efforts focused on the 2 last stages, that is, response and recovery. Authorities had a reactive position when there were catastrophes. In other words, catastrophes had to happen for institutions and administrations that are closer to citizens to start acting. On the other hand, we must focus or consider the legal nature of the framework for action. And we're going to talk about this later on. The second text that I want to highlight is the framework, because although the Hyogo framework for action was adopted, the figures remained high. So the UN decided that the initial approach need to be shifted, and there was a change from reaction to action. So all stages of catastrophes need to be addressed in a holistic way, identifying all the needs of each stage. Under this new perspective, the UN adopted the Sendai Framework, which is current right now. It was passed in 2015, and it will be in force until 2030. The previous experience highlighted the need to have international plans to include better the risk of disaster, and that public policies had to be strengthened and international cooperation had to be improved. Thus, it was urgent, the UN said that it was urgent and fundamental to foresee the risk of catastrophes and to plan measures as well as to reduce the risk to protect people and communities and countries more efficiently, as well as their livelihood, health, cultural assets, economic assets, and ecosystems, thus reinforcing their resilience. Risk planning starts, as I said, to be perceived as something that could not wait, and public investments were considered crucial. So if we leave aside investments, because I'm sure that Pablo could tell us more about this aspect, the adoption of plans for risk mitigation had major advantages. The first one was to reduce risk, cost reduction, preventive measures specific for that, disaster-specific preventive measures could be adopted, and situations that could avoid personal and material losses could be adopted. Another very important aspect, society could be given certainty. Public authorities were not passive anymore. Certainty could be given to society. The most vulnerable sectors could be protected, and vulnerabilities, threats, strengths, and opportunities could be identified, and the efficiency of the protocols could be identified. Potential deviations could be adopted as long as there was previous planning. This prior planning, as we have been seeing, was shown at the UN, and the European Union has developed and regularized this prevention. Before talking about the intervention of the Union, I want to emphasize the 2001 agenda adopted by the Assembly on September 2015. It's a plan to defend peace, alliances, prosperity, the planet, and all of this. And I don't know if this is one of the main characteristics of this text from a world perspective. This is when the Sustainable Development Goals are defined.
All of them work towards the 3 dimensions of the sustainable development economy, society, and environment. So now I think I need to make a consideration about the 2 texts, the 2 last texts, the Sendai Framework for Action and the Agenda, because both coincide in assessing efficiently the effects of the catastrophes, but they also stress that the prior evaluation of a catastrophe and the preventive measures should be taken seriously and early. And both plans need to be implemented and accepted by all countries and the stakeholders in all alliances for cooperation. About the nature of these texts, will be my next presentation. These new texts address the importance of the catastrophes and the measures to be taken. As we can see, we have action plans, regulations, mechanisms. So it shows that multi-level cooperation is necessary. Cooperation is mentioned in all publications, at least theoretically. As Fernando Liesa said, the existence of these international texts about disasters has enabled us to configure, to set up all the main action and intervention rules that we can find in the international law and the member states' laws. But I agree with the author that there are such a big amount of texts that address disasters or the crisis scenarios that they make up for a complex task if you want to identify the texts that can be applied to a specific case. The legal security is present in these words. It is not just, the problem is not just the volume of text, but also that they have unequal statuses. They're not all of them are legally binding. So we need more general rules, general laws about natural or human disasters. The problem is that we have many sectoral texts with a questioned legal efficiency. I cannot deny that there are some legally binding texts, such as the Paris Agreement that has been recently adopted, but it is true that they have similar characteristics, all of them dominated by the soft law, as we call it in English and in Spanish. García Sarmiento, Rodríguez Escudero say that they have similar characteristics. They have their own characteristics. Which are the ones that have made it possible for the international success of that type of law. I'm checking here about flexibility for their adoption, exclusion from the traditional sources of the law. There's a certain escape from the normative rigidity. There is a prevalence of the celerity and the speed to accept them, the good faith, vague terms. The agreements are made with hot topics in an international context. There is an absence of a sanctioning regime. There is no disciplinary regime. These are some of the traits, the main traits that justify the success of the soft law texts. But my question to you is, must soft law be used to create important action plans to address crisis situations that need to be homogeneously applied by the states, or, on the contrary, should be work towards the creation of more specific norms that could legally bind the states, because the new catastrophes do not necessarily have to limit themselves to a certain country, for example, COVID-19. The authors that I have quoted highlight some disadvantages of the soft law. The first one being that it doesn't have legally binding characteristics. It doesn't mean that it won't have any legal effects, because we must remember that when countries ratified the Charter of the United Nations Charter, countries commit to adopt measures, joint measures or separate measures, in cooperation with the organization to promote international solutions, be it sanitary, social, or economic solutions. Another problem is the absence of a disciplinary legal regime in case of violation. So if a country decides not to abide by those solutions, they are in an inferior status. And thirdly, and this is the end of the section of the problems of this type of law, the third problem is the high number of international texts for catastrophes and national norms. That creates for much confusion on the competent authorities when they really want to coordinate themselves, coordinate with each other, and take actions. We can find a clear conflict, for example, if we think that the rules that have been approved by the member states might not be in line with the international regulations. If the member states have texts with a broader scope than the texts provided by the United Nations, that wouldn't be a problem. But the contrary is also possible. If a member state has a regulation that is more restrictive than the international ones, that would be very difficult to implement. The United Nations has already decided in a crisis situation that the prevention must be the main thing. And the European Union has already implemented new decisions and the new shift of paradigm in all texts. That's why I'm going to talk about the contribution of the European Union before catastrophes, in the light of catastrophes. My experience and our experience has enabled us to verify that accidents do not stay within one member state. They can affect a whole continent or the whole world. And the intervention of states cannot be done unilaterally. We must reflect on the need for joint efforts, joint replies, joint responses among different countries and stakeholders. And for that, the European Union has developed several mechanisms based on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And based on that treaty, I am going to highlight the solidarity clause. But before, I would like to say something else about solidarity, because there are many interventions the European Union has led many interventions in case of catastrophes. For example, the Ebola outbreak in Africa, the European Union was there, or in the case of the floods in Europe or in the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an important deployment of means and help, even if late. And finally, the eruption of the volcano in La Palma in Spain. It is true that the European Union has not intervened, but it's because Spain has not asked for help, to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge. But it is a situation in which the European Union should intervene. They will be able to do so because this type of interventions are considered by the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. So as I was saying, I was going to highlight the clause of solidarity. I am the last one. What can I say about the solidarity clause that has not been said by my colleagues? There is not much I can contribute to, or I contribute with, but I want to quote Robert Schuman. I find his words very relevant for this, when he said that the global peace cannot be safeguarded without creating efforts that are that amount to the dangers that threaten it. And of course, the other one, Europe would not be done in one go, but through many interventions that will create de facto solidarity. Many interventions have taken place under the solidarity principle, but Article 222 of the treaty mentions the solidarity clause in two main cases: if there is a terrorist attack or a catastrophe, be it human or natural. In the light of those situations, the European Union can mobilize all instruments, both civil and military instruments. And I want to highlight it, both civil and military. So if a state is under a terrorist attack or a disaster, the state normally has intervened unilaterally. But the clause, the solidarity clause, enables the European Union to use joint or complementary tools without affecting the member states' competencies, because the solidarity clause starts when the political authorities of a state demand them. So they respect the national identity and the loyal cooperation principle. So as I was saying, the European Union has both civil and military instruments that are put at their disposal by the member states. So the member states have to facilitate that help, have to provide it with that help, of course, if they have the capacity. And then the European Union jointly will deploy them in its country. But the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union does not describe the protocol or the procedure of the civil or the military instruments to be used. Some authors say that some of the big challenges of the solidarity clause does not lie in the how to apply it, but in how quickly, because it has to be done at a speed, as soon as possible. And we cannot confuse the solidarity clause with the mutual assistance clause, the latter being only for cases of armed aggression in a territory or victims of terrorist attacks, but not for natural or human catastrophes. In this case, well, I won't have the time to talk about it that very much, but I will talk about the French case. In the media, you remember when there was a terror attack in France in 2015, and many press notes said that France had activated the solidarity clause, but France did not activate the solidarity clause. France asked for help to the rest of the European countries and then activated the mutual assistance clause, not the solidarity clause. And many authors wonder why they activated the mutual assistance clause and not the solidarity clause. But some authors think that they did so because if you activate the mutual assistance clause, the European Union institutions do not intervene. It's only the member states that intervene, and France did not want the institutions to intervene. They didn't want any direct intervention on the part of the European Union. Probably Professor BUSSIÈRE will be more knowledgeable about it than me and probably will clarify it. In Article 2022 of the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, as I said, it states that the European Union cannot work in an isolated way. For that clause in that clause, and many texts of the European Union refer to it, for example, the decision of the 24th of June 2014 regarding the modalities for to apply the solidarity clause within the Union, and it reminds us of the three instruments: the inner strategy, the inner security strategy, and the civil protection mechanism. And that is the one I'm going to talk about, which is a successor of the community mechanism for civil protection since 2013. That was created to reinforce the cooperation between the member states and the European Union and to facilitate the coordination of the civil protection mechanisms. Before moving on to that topic, I would like to talk about civil protection, but why? Most of the actions that take place in a situation of catastrophe are civil protection actions, for example, emergency protection, rescue, fires, etc. It all pertains to the big field of civil protection, and this competence is in Article 6 and 196.1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So you have to take into account that that competence is of a shared nature. So the first is the member states. The member state that is being a victim of the problem will intervene first, and the rest of countries will help in coordinating or complementing the civil protection provided by the first member state. Only when the first member state cannot cope with the situation can it ask the rest of the member states for help in terms of civil protection. So it doesn't only cover the European Union member states, but also third member states or third states that are outside of the European Union. It has been activated in 420 occasions, both by member states and non-member states. Many catastrophes, for example, fires in Sweden, Bolivia and Greece, the tropical cyclone Ida in Mozambique, an earthquake in Albania, both in 2019, or, for example, in 2020. That mechanism was activated in 102 occasions, 85 of them being directly linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is undoubtedly true that the success of that mechanism is the result of the legal trajectory, and the European Union has really listened to the demands of the member states and the actors that take part in those catastrophic situations.
Voy a proceder a abordar el incremento de las...
I'm going to address the increase of new technologies. I don't want to run out of time to address this topic. The increase of new technologies in the situation of catastrophe, specifically drones. I'm going to start with a sentence that Professor Freixas pronounced in this seminar. She said that when we think about the Europe of the past and the present, I mean, it's correct, obviously, but we need to think about the future, the Europe of the future. And I learned from the past, but I find myself in the present, and we need solutions for the future. And it's a future that needs to be addressed quickly. And as I was saying, the institutions of the Union and member states are increasingly improving the response to catastrophes. This allowed the improvement of all involved stakeholders and the technical means. I want to emphasize again the Sendai Framework, because it emphasized that not only planning of risks had to be addressed, but also that we need to act based on the present and future challenges, and we need to perfect these systems. But to this end, we must implement different measures, and it emphasizes financial, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, and political measures. Currently, the use of new technologies is one option, in my view, and it's more of an imperative, a must, than an option. For example, unmanned vessels in situations of risks are nothing new. Helicopters have been used for years, but the advance of technologies made it possible for the aeronautic industry to develop other types of aircrafts. And now I'm talking about unmanned vessels known as drones. Drones, also known as WAV, well, they're called drones because in many texts we can find RPAs. Those are unmanned aircrafts that are remotely controlled, and then we have autonomous aircrafts. The European institutions were scared of regulating this topic because obviously there's no pilot in any drone, but there's nobody controlling through a remote control that aircraft. I want to congratulate the different institutions because they were able to include the regulation of autonomous aircrafts, and they were assimilated to remotely controlled aircrafts. So whenever I talk about drones, I'm talking both I'm referring to those that are remotely controlled and those who are not controlled at all, because those are covered by regulation. Drones were included in an airspace over a century ago for the military services, and the development of their techniques with civil purposes has given them great potential. Where can we see these potentials? Well, in surveillance and control situations, being able to have a control for long periods, for a long time, like what's happening with the volcano in La Palma. These make it possible to develop these technologies further. Their capacity to be, their lightweight and their easiness make them very useful. They can monitor environmental parameters and anticipate disasters. These catastrophes can have thermal or infrared cameras, which makes it possible to monitor the different situations. Also, for humanitarian rescues, the use of software and GPS makes it possible, and this is something that has been done by the National Police and the Civil Guard in Spain. This has made it possible to use drones to look for people who got lost in forests or in places with very hard access. However, and we have this last situation, health emergencies, this use has already been tested, using drones to take, for example, a fibrillator to a place, and in situations where the response time is of vital importance. A few days ago, it was said that in places of Ghana that are very hard to access, drones are being used to take vaccines against COVID-19. The advantages of these aircrafts in crisis situations is obvious. But the legal framework that defines the use of these aircrafts is almost non-existent. And this is where I want to make some comments. Action plans that we find do not foresee specifically the use of drones by civil protection. Competences are the responsibility of the member states. So the legal framework that we currently have does not finish until 2023, and there is no plan to have a specific framework for the use of drones in these situations, because in a situation like, for example, when there's a fire, border control, rescues, those are considered activities not covered by the European Air Security Agency. So aircrafts used for these purposes are excluded. So what is the legal framework for these aircrafts? The EU made it clear. It depends on the member states. It's up to the member states to regulate these uses. These aspects are very much connected to security, national security, or civil protection, aspects that may be affected in a situation of crisis, and the use of drones for prevention purposes must be regulated by each member state. This situation causes two aspects. The first one is that the fact that each state regulates unilaterally the use of the aircrafts causes a lack of coordination, and we must take into account that these aircrafts are used by public authorities and therefore people who are trained. So if we had specific plans where the use of these aircrafts was established, for example, in a situation of cross-border activities, these drones would operate under legal certainty, legal responsibility, and the avoidance of arbitrarity by public powers. I want to wrap up by saying that we must improve public policies in the field of prevention. Also, the coordination between member states. Well, the emergency center that was created under the civil protection mechanism, and this center works every day, 24/7. So we can say that the EU is providing a flexible, coordinated and not duplicated response. In connection to new technologies, they must be implemented, of course, but we should never forget that new technologies should not only be conceived the state institutions. Local authorities are very important because it's also authorities that are closer to citizens are the first ones that have to respond, and their role is very, very important. The role of local entities must be taken into account, and it must be studied what the specific places where these means have to be deployed. And finally, we have to talk about the funding system. Europe, due to the crisis caused by COVID-19, made it clear that the funding was insufficient in situations of crisis because the union protection mechanism was modified after this crisis situation, and more budget has been allowed. I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much. If you have any question, I would love to answer your questions.
Parfait. So thank you very much. I agree with your paper, but I think we need some complement.
It's open. It's open.
It's okay. We need some complement on information. You spoke about drones, and we saw these animals on the photo. But what is the difference between that you can make with a drone and one you can make with a plane, aeroplane, helicopter, and also with satellites? In the field of prevention, with a drone you can film, you can see, with a satellite also. So I think perhaps it's interesting for us to understand what is very new in the drone. The second point is you explain us the difficulty to create an European regulation about the use of drone. I think my question is are there regulations for satellite, for planes, and what are the differences? Where is the specificity? My third question is, why is it so difficult? Is it because you know these new technology are often double use technology? So with a drone, you can anticipate, but you can have also intelligence activities. You can have defense or aggressive activities. If I am a terrorist group, I use a drone to prepare something. So there is a sort of uncertainty, and I think it could be interesting to precise. And also in your paper, you speak about natural catastrophe, but sometimes you speak about a terrorist catastrophe. If you want to prevent terrorist catastrophe, you can use drone, but it's absolutely not the same because here you are in intelligence activities. So, you know, this mix of potentiality must be explained, and I think it's an interesting debate.
Sí, muchas gracias por la.
Thank you very much for your intervention and your work. I'm sorry I had to leave the room, but I really needed to. It was an emergency. I just wanted to make a question. The responsibility of whoever is controlling the drone, because we're not talking about a technology. I mean, we may say that it's a neutral technology, but the outcomes of its use are not neutral at all. So someone needs to be responsible for all the consequences of that technology. And that's a question for you, and thanks for your work. Patricia, congratulations for your work and for shedding light on this and opening a new field, because we keep hearing about drones. I feel that it would be very interesting and necessary in your work, because your work has future. It's something that's very current. So maybe you could analyze the well, you have talked about the potential of the new technologies and the reinforcement of the new technologies, and this is very much connected to the digitalization vector. It's connected to the digitalization as part of the Next Generation EU and the Green Pact. Since everything that drones involve in terms of regulations, norms, responsibilities, as Professor Freixes said, I think it would be important to shed light on this and connect it to the fact that although the European Union, in comparison to other emerging markets, the EU is not strong in the development of robotics, artificial intelligence, and digitalization and technologies, the EU is continuously making a stance and is very strong in the terms of regulations. When it comes to digitalization, the EU is being very strong in terms of regulations of new technologies and digitalization. So I think you have field to explore ahead of you to connect new technologies, digitalization, robotics, artificial intelligence, and European Union regulations, and the need to have regulation, shared responsibility, and the rules that define everything. Because the EU in this field is of legal age compared to other countries.
Gonza first.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
In the first place, I want to thank you for your comments. I feel very fortunate to hear your words, and all your comments are very timely, and it really makes sense to include them in my work. I will try to answer your questions with the knowledge that I have. I will start with Professor Eric BUSSIÈRE, and he was asking me about differences between drones, aircrafts, helicopters, or satellites from a preventive measure. The first thing that we have to take into account is that drones are nothing new. We may think that drones are something new, but they're not. Drones are new in terms of civilian uses, but drones have existed for over a century. In Second World War, drones were already used. It's not that there was research going on. Yes, the use was developed, but the drones were there already. So it's nothing new. But it was after 2010 where there was a new technologies fair in Hanover, and many authors agree that that was the beginning of the new era, when the deployment of these aircrafts are used for civilian uses. My studies are focused on civilian uses because there's a democratization of these aircrafts, and we want to analyze why did this happen, why are they so successful. But differences, you ask about differences, and this is one of the most important things. Differences come from the use, because from a military perspective, drones are regulated militarily. I don't address that, because legislators base their work on military aspects. But now we're talking about civilian uses, so I cannot compare this to an aircraft or an airplane. Airplanes, well, it's the international law. We have the International Organization of Civil Aviation, has numerous texts that set the guidelines, And then we have the European Agency for Airspace and the National Organization for Air Security. And I understand how they work, and this is something that I shared with my colleagues. These organizations work under an umbrella that is security and safety. And security and safety are increased after September 11th. September 11th are a milestone in many aspects, as we have said in this seminar, but in aeronautic law, everything changes. In terms of differences, airplanes have a legal framework, and we must know that, I think it's not comparable. We can't compare a Boeing 737 to a phantom drone that is 100 grams or 25 grams.
So the norms are completely different from each one, and now the international bodies separate the norms. Drones cannot carry people. They cannot carry lives. So the air taxis, which are drones, are very in a very incipient status, because in a very early stages of functioning, just the blueprints or the prototypes. So planes have their own sets of regulations, helicopters have their own sets of regulations. Regarding the satellites, they belong to the aerospatial law and not the aircraft law, because the aerospace law allows for the exploration of the airspace, but there are other problems. The scope of each state, vertically speaking, towards the infinite. So we cannot compare satellites, helicopters, planes, and drones, because the aerospatial law has different sets of regulations. It is true that planes, satellites, and helicopters do have some common characteristics, but they cannot be compared with drones. From a preventative point of view, a satellite, a civil person does not have the prerogative to launch a satellite. Well, I wouldn't dare to say, to express myself vehemently or adamantly, because nobody knows nowadays, but the authorities and the lawmakers have to rethink the situation, how to legislate this, because how to regulate this, because when drones will start being used by anyone, because drones are not a toy, they are aircrafts, and they have to comply with, they have to abide by the law. We sometimes see devices that look like drones, but they are toys in reality, because they are very small. So of course they have to comply with a different directive, the directive for toys. But once real drones will be owned by many people, or even there will be drone pilots, etc., authorities will need to be concerned about it. Why? For safety reasons, because drones are using the same space that other aircrafts use, for example, or they interfere with the radioelectric waves. Regarding the difficulty to create a regulation in the European Union for the use of drones, yeah, there has been an attempt to create regulation, and it has encountered many problems. Each member state of the European Union had its own regulation, and in 2018 the European Union created a common rule. There was only a prior to that, there was only a rule for drones of over 150 kilograms of weight, which almost nobody had, only in the military area. But once the European Union saw that the air safety and air security was in danger, it decided to launch a common norm. But there are some aspects that affect some national competencies, for example, research, military, etc. And the European Union knows it cannot interfere with those competencies. In a situation of catastrophe where you really need to act quickly, the first obstacle is that I cannot use the drone because the regulation does not cover me. If there is a fire in the border between Portugal and Spain, I cannot fly my drone over Portugal. Of course, the public authorities try to collaborate and cooperate, but we have to understand the regulation as it is. And the national competencies have a limit that cannot be surpassed. Yes, there are rules that have a double use. There are some studies that manifested the perception of the society about the drones is getting better and better, but it's not positive because drones are seen as weapons to be used on wars, military in any case, of military nature. Also for exploration, but and also for now that they are being used to rescue people, the society is beginning to accept them because they don't see them as devices that violate rights. You remember that cameras a few years ago, were being seen as a threat because they interfered with our private life. And drones are the responsibility of the pilots that need to be compliant with the data privacy regulation. Those who work in this field know that the responsibility regime that are applied to drones depend on the state. In Spain, does not have a specific regime for drones. The same sanctions are applied for a drone and a plane. For me, that's incomparable. Of course, they can be both harmful, but it's not the same kind of harm. A big plane, of course, will be more harmful than an 8-kilo drone. It's not comparable, so they cannot have the same sanctions. 8 million euros in both cases? No, it's not possible. So the Spanish lawmakers have to elaborate, have to adapt to legislation. And different uses in case of wars, yes. But we see more and more advantages of the uses, of the positive uses of drones. The European Union recommends all pilots to subscribe social responsibilities, civil responsibility insurance. Sorry. It is true that the harm that a drone can have has been studied. The impact is especially harmful for drones over 8 joules, capable of exerting a damage of a pressure of over 8 joules. But, well, the legislation needs to be more flexible and adaptable to the use of drones. And they need to regulate authorization for pilots and drivers. Professor Del Rio, I totally agree with you. I can't say anything else. The digitalization and the big data is something hot in the European Union. I know the European Union is working on those fields. There are white papers. But it is true that we don't have any legally binding regulation or rules, and the new regulation will not be finished before 2023. because it's the public administrations that are working on this legislation, and public administration is slow. So yes, something is being done with the European funds that will be very interesting, and I commit myself to try and research it. And it is true that the European Union accepts advice and recommendations on the part of the national authorities, but the idea would be to create a common policy.
Sí. Muchísimas gracias por la tua presentación. If I can, some remarks, brief remarks, because I'm happy that you entered in one of my research fields, in my current research field. So I have some tips that I can give you that are useful. First of all, I'm happy that you have this approach, and it's about the civilian use of this technology that is mostly known for its military uses, employments. So it's always associated, drones are always associated to, in negative way, of course. But I'd like to point out that space, unfortunately, is absolutely unruled, ungoverned by any treaty. We have only one treaty, that is the treaty that regulates the celestial bodies, including the moon, and it's the only one. You can put weapons over there, but it's unruled. There are a couple of proposals that were presented within the United Nations by Russia and China, and they were rejected by the United States. This is why the hypersonic weapons are a real threat, because they can have both a conventional or nuclear payload. So this is in their warheads. So this is a real challenge, even because there is no definition, there is no legal definition of outer space. So the sky, above the sky there is space, but when starts, it's something that is defined unconventionally by doctrine and so on, but there is not a treaty that says where space begins, where it starts. So this is a really tricky issue. And just to say that unmanned drones, that are the unmanned aerial vehicles, are not the only. I suggest you to broaden your paper, including also something about the other autonomous unmanned systems, because there are naval systems also that the United States has already experimented, and submarine unmanned system also. So it's not only the ones flying. There are a couple of other objects that are and will be tested and employed without crew. And just to say another thing is that there is a huge discussion about artificial intelligence. There is a huge debate about also drones within the UN Convention on the Limitation of Weapons. There is an intergovernmental group that is called the GGA on Laws, that is group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems. There's a huge debate. You go there, and you see that the world is divided into the United States. They want to give all the power to machine to take also decision that is machine learning that derives from artificial intelligence. There's something. It's another level, but relies on autonomous systems at the end. So you have machines that are self-governed. This is a real tricky issue, real one. And so if you want to go through you find everything. This is a group that held meetings in Geneva, usually twice a year. And just to close up, and there is also, I suggest you to consider also the EU proposal that is drafted 2 months ago. That is the first regulation proposed by European Commission on the regulation of artificial intelligence. But unfortunately, it doesn't consider the military employments of artificial intelligence. Why insist on the fact that whichever use of artificial intelligence should comply with fundamental human rights. That is something strange because you use them in war, no? So that should be regulated, that domain, not the civilian one, but that one. And just to close up, I suggest you also to consider for your paper the GIS technology, that is Geographic Information System through satellites, that has powerful uses for controlling territory. This through digital images. So it matches very well with the drones in this case for for floods and everything, disasters and whatever else. It's GIS technology. Thanks very much. Muchas gracias.
So, one more question. So, if you want to make a comment.
Ok. Marco, muchísimas gracias por las aportaciones.
Marco, thank you very much for your contribution. Regarding the non-regulated space, of course, I know the space is regulated. I am not saying that it's regulated in treaties, but the International Civil Aviation Organization has divided the space in several spaces, several places, 9 heights, for example. The first one, the inner space, is until 7,600 feet, or meters, sorry. And the rest, the outer space, is above 7,600 meters. So that division exists. I'm not saying it was the International Civil Aviation Organization that did it, but, well, they are the source. They are the international organization that regulates the airspace and aviation. So I don't know if it's included in a treaty, but we do know exactly what is inner space and what is outer space, because that has to be regulated. Otherwise, you could not use an aircraft from here to Madrid or from Madrid to Colombia. So everything's regulated. I know regarding your second question, I know the naval unmanned vehicles, but I don't talk about them because the legal regulation is completely different. The legal framework is completely different. So that's why I don't talk about them. And I know there are unmanned submarines and other types of unmanned devices that use that are in the seas, but the legal framework is completely different. The problem with the drones is that the airspace is public space, and that's why we have many problems. For example, the radioelectric space that is very limited and completely regulated is used by these devices. But the naval unmanned systems do not use the same space, the same place. They have other problems, but their legal framework is completely different. Thank you for talking about the groups of the United Nations that talk about the weapon limitation. It is true, and yes, we need to discuss the possibility of machines making decisions autonomously, from naval to aerial point of view. There are many films that have already showcased it. It's really frightening, and I think Europe has a leading role here. It has to be a leading but coordinated role, because all of us are looking for the same thing: peace, protection of human rights, or rights in general, and they want to all keep their competencies. But the European Union has to play a leading role. I know the proposal of the European Union in terms of artificial intelligence. That's a very interesting field too. We need to develop it further. That's it. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for this interesting session. And I think we have now to transfer us